You know, there are two downsides to how fast we're building this layout. First of all, since we now have a layout that's actually partially decorated, I kinda just wanna watch trains run through the pretty landscape. I'm proud of how this project is going so far, and it's nice to relax and just take in what we've done. Secondly, my father, seeing the progress that we've made on the Little Loop Railroad, has been inspired to continue work on his own layout. At face value, there's actually nothing bad about these circumstances. It's important to take breaks. It's good to relax. My father can vouch for that because he hasn't worked on his own layout in about a year. There's definitely some good we've gotten out of these distractions, but they are distractions. There's only a month left until the train show that I want to display this layout at. Slacking off is more dangerous than I would like it to be, and right now I'm actually a bit behind on my planning. The work featured in today's video was supposed to take only 1 week to make, but it took us 2. Now, is this the end of the world? Nah, not really. We've got some great progress to show you today. First things first, we need more grass. The desert is looking nice, but the mountain is looking a bit barren. Some of this grass worked the same way as it did in the desert. We would paint on a layer of glue, then sprinkle on a layer of foam. But for the more visible grass, usually nearest to the tracks or the edge of the layout, we did something a little bit different. Static grass. If you've never heard of it, static grass is quite interesting. It starts similarly to foam turf. You lay down some glue, then just sprinkle on small fibers to represent the grass. What makes static grass special, however, is that it uses static electricity to get the grass to stand upright as the glue is drying. You see this pin stuck into the layout? That's the ground wire. The little black tube we're shaking over the grass is the applicator. On the bottom of the applicator is an electrified metal mesh. This, plus the grounded wire, creates the static electricity that makes the fibers stand upright. It can be hard to get a good applicator for static grass, but fortunately my father had one laying around. And boy, oh boy, the results speak for themselves. In some spots, I thought the grass looked a little bit too green, so I added some patches of regular brown turf and glued it in place using diluted matte medium. This helped to add some variety and texture, though I'm not sure how easy it'll be to actually notice in the final product. Then again, it's probably better to have texture that blends in than no texture that sticks out like a sore thumb. With the grass done, I moved on to probably the most impactful step of this video, adding trees. Ironically, it was probably the easiest step, too. For any given tree, all I had to do was figure out where I wanted it to go, jab a hole in the ground, add some superglue, and stick the trunk in place. Even with 63 trees to plant, this step was pretty fast and pretty easy. But there was one problem. I ran out of trees. We need to buy more. So the top of the mountain is a little bit barren until we can fix that problem. Next came the track and the ballast, which honestly we should have done before adding the trees, since the trees just made it harder to access the track. Ah well, hindsight for the next project, right? First, we cleaned up the track by vacuuming up any grass that was still on the ties. Honestly, this wasn't as effective as we had hoped it would be, and some of the ties remained pretty grassy. When we finally got around to adding the ballast though, all the grass that was still around kinda just got covered up anyways, so it turned out okay. After vacuuming the track, we added some spare ties to the openings underneath the rails. These openings were most common where the flex track joined another piece of track, as we had to cut away ties in the flex track to make the rail joiners fit. We probably should have secured these ties somehow, as the next step was to flip the layout on its side to spray paint the ties. Fortunately, all of the new ties stayed in place just fine. The reason for spray painting the track, though, at least from what I can understand, is that we kinda just used whatever track my father had available, so some of the ties were different colors from one another. Most of them were brown, but some of them were black, and the browns were kind of inconsistent. So we just spray painted them all. While we were vacuuming the tracks just a minute ago, you might have noticed the tape on the switches. My father covered the most vital parts of each switch to make sure that he wouldn't damage them while spray painting. This included the tip of the points and the joint where the points turn away from the rest of the rail. Those are the most sensitive parts of any piece of track, so we wanted to try and protect them a little bit. With that said, we didn't really want the paint to stick anywhere on the top of the rails, as the rails are supposed to conduct electricity to get the trains to run. So, as my father spray painted, occasionally we would take small breaks, and I would come with a paper towel and wipe down the rails. With the track all painted and pretty, we could finally add some ballast. On the outside of the ties, we had painted on some Elmer's glue before sprinkling on a layer of Woodland Scenic's Coarse Cinders ballast. For the inside of the tracks, we instead laid the ballast first, sprayed it with some water mixed half and half with 70% alcohol, and then added diluted matte medium at a 1:6 ratio. The water and alcohol mix helped the matte medium penetrate in between the ties and ballast better, making it easier for the glue to settle in the spaces that it needed to. As the matte medium dried, I used a single passenger truck to test flange clearance. This was a good start, but in many cases it just wasn't enough to actually clear the space for the trains. When I first tested Snickerdoodle on the newly ballasted tracks, she kept derailing. What I figured out was two things. One, the flanges on the passenger truck were not enough force to remove any problematic ballast, so the truck just glided around the problem spots instead of knocking them out of place. Two, the bottom clearance on a locomotive is slightly lower than that of a freight car on average, since the locomotive needs a gear to turn the driving wheels. Said gear has to hang down a little lower than normal, and thus the clearance on a locomotive is usually the top of the rail. It's a little less forgiving than a freight car or a passenger car. To fix these mistakes, I used a putty knife and cut away at the problematic ballast to clear it. For the lower locomotive clearance, I ran the knife along the top of the rail to clear anything that went above it. For the flanges, I scraped along the insides of the rail to clear out the space. That wasn't really the hardest part of ballasting, though. The hardest was doing the points of the switches. They still need to move, which means you can't get ballast in between the rails or the switch will jam. You also have to be cautious of the actual mechanism to throw the switch, since it needs a little bit of room on the outside of the track so that it can move freely. On top of that, you don't want to accidentally glue the points in place. That would be a big mistake. Once the ballast had had some time to dry, we went over the layout with our shop vac to clean up any excess that had been scattered away from the tracks. Now, you would think the force of the vacuum would suck off more than just the loose ballast, but by this point so much of the layout had been glued in place that it really wasn't an issue. Also, we used a very long extension for the vacuum to lessen its sucking power. After that was cleaned up, we decorated any spots near the ballast that we hadn't grassed up yet. If you watched the last episode, you might remember that there were some holes in the groundwork we had to patch up near the end of the episode. These were hidden from us thanks to tape protecting the track and overlapping on the groundwork a little bit, and for some reason they were most common in the desert side of the layout. Whatever the case though, if there wasn't enough grass, we touched up the area. The last thing to mention for today was cleaning up the fascia. When we flipped the layout on its side, my father went ahead and sawed away a couple of parts of the fascia that was overhanging. This, of course, damaged the fascia a bit, but the fascia had already been cosmetically damaged from grass, paint, and ground goop spilling over the edge. So I just sanded down any parts that stuck out a little too far, then repainted the whole fascia to make it one nice, consistent color. And with that, today's episode comes to a close. It's a little shorter than usual, but we still got a lot of work done. The layout is really starting to take shape, but I actually think I'm gonna pump the brakes on the natural scenery for a little bit. Not on the project, of course, there's still more to do, but I have to wait for some parts to come in. And we have a lot of building kits that I could focus on. Nonetheless, I'm really proud of how far along we are right now. I can't wait to display this at the show in January. Thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, yada yada. Whatever you do, have a good day. Cheers, folks.